So first of all, I'd like to say that this is one more year that we are hosting the Jim Londis and Family Lectureship. And this, for those who don't know, I think has been going on for the past 3 years or so, where the Londis family is sponsoring most of our, if all of our conference, and the lecturers who come and gift us with their lecture. And what Jim Londis had as a vision, I believe, and he wasn't able to be here today, but he's watching us on Zoom. And so thank you, Jim and family. It was a vision to bridge the gap between Adventist and non-Adventist scholarship, philosophical scholarship. And what I think is so beautiful about that is really a two-way road of introducing Adventist scholarship to non-Adventist scholars, and vice versa, non-Adventists to our community, and thus enriching us and the way that we think about philosophy and theology. And he also had the vision of taking what we do here to Adventist education, Adventist universities. And so we're thankful to this wonderful family who helps us have these conferences. And I'd also like to start off by thanking the board, the committee of the Society of Adventist Philosophers. We have Yishen Ma, our VP, whose incredible analytic and sharp thought has just always been so helpful to us as a committee. He brings his intelligence by knowing more of the philosophical fields that we talk about than anyone else in the committee, and also calls out our inconsistencies and incoherences. So I'm grateful to that. Jim Walters, who's our secretary, always finds a variety of solutions to the problems that we always are able to come up with, and has created the most excellent minutes that the history of the society has ever seen. You should see the detail. It's just incredible. Lauren Klim, who's our treasurer, who's responsible for having the skills of website design and construction and organization that all of us lack. And Roy Ben, who's our advisor, who deeply loves this society and powerfully brings us together and models openness to new ideas like no one else in the committee. So I'm very grateful for everyone, for the team that we've made this year. So finally, I have the honor of introducing our James Londis and Family Lecturer for this year's conference. Dr. Linn Marie Tonstad is Associate Professor of Theology, Religion, and Sexuality at Yale Divinity School. Professor Tonstad is a systematic, constructive theologian, specialized in the area of gender and sexuality, and a prominent voice within the specific endeavor of queer theology. She is the author of 2 groundbreaking books in the field. Her first, God and Difference, the Trinity, Sexuality, and the Transformation of Finitude, was very well received by the ethical and theological community. And her most recent work, and arguably her most massive contribution to theology, is entitled Queer Theology Beyond Apologetics, published in 2018. Now, there is so much about this work that I have come to learn about, and most of it is way above my cognitive capacities. However, both books have a common endeavor: to push the field of gender and sexuality within theology, and why not the very members of the LGBTQ community, to look beyond apologetic readings of key passages of the Bible, beyond certain feminist and queer interpretations of the triune nature of God, or even of human culture and human nature as historically queer. For her, the desire to do these things, in other words, to do queer apologetics, though understandable, is misguided. It accepts the rules that have been set and raises resistance within the context of those rules. By deconstructing binaries and dichotomies, critical theorists often create other binaries and dichotomies, or other rigid and sometimes intolerant forms of constructing the world and human nature. Rather, what queer theology can offer is a tool for Christian theology, social and cultural criticism, and anthropology, is not merely a simplistic version of anti-essentialism, but the tool of taking seriously the story of creation. By this, she doesn't mean taking seriously the creationist story, but the story that God created the universe, and in particular, that God created it in motion and in constant transformation. That this is part of the structure of reality opens us as creatures up to several losses and vulnerability, but it also expands the possibility of how we understand the fluidity built within human life. As many of you know or assume based upon Linn's surname, her religious roots are in Seventh-day Adventism. I was struck upon hearing from her in a recent podcast that one of the inheritances of Adventism that has led her to the world of academia in general and to queer theology in particular is Adventism's push toward a personal search of truth. I would like to welcome Dr. Tonstad to the Society of Adventist Philosophers, where we take this Adventist heritage seriously as well. She will now present to us her paper entitled Theological Anthropology in a Different Key. Please help me welcome.
You know how you're always supposed to say that was an absolutely generous introduction? I don't think I've ever been introduced with so much insight before. You understand what I'm trying to do. This is amazing. I am fairly regularly quoted as having said the things that I then go on to critique, right? So I really greatly appreciated that. That was marvelous. And I want to start by expressing my gratitude to the organizing committee that invited me, especially to Jim Walters and Marina Gardner for the communicativeness, and apologize publicly, as I have already done privately, to Yushen for getting the paper to him much later than I had promised, in fact, Monday morning of this week. The reason for the delay is the subject of my talk today, the temporality and inseparability of thinking flesh, of flesh that thinks. But it has also taught me not to imagine in the future that when I'm giving what I think of as a bigger talk, I can let go of it much more than 2-3 days ahead. So now at least we know that for the next time. Friends, it's been a long time since I talked to Adventists. I say this both in gratitude and apology. Gratitude in that it's a rare opportunity to renew and refresh the opportunities and conversations that made me in conversation with the best of contemporary Adventist thinking gathered in this room and with my first teacher of philosophy present. And an apology that many of the openings y'all have been part of creating, and I know how hard it is to create those openings, how much work goes into that, have happened after and beyond the time that I spent in Adventist environments. And there's always a risk in trying to speak into a conversation in which one is no longer a native. Ask me what it feels to lecture in Norwegian, one of my 2 native languages, after 20 years of living my professional life in English. I sound like a high schooler. Which I may now do again. But we all know that there's no ex-Adventist in the most fundamental sense for those of us who were truly made by this world, as I was. And there's one part of the Adventist message that has unlocked, I guess 2 parts based on your, I actually think there's 3 because it's also the interest in transformation, but we'll talk about one of them today. One part of the Adventist message that has ineluctably made me as a scholar and person, which are not separate in my experience. What I've found most insightful within Seventh-day Adventism is that bedrock of philosophical anthropology in an Adventist key, the recognition that there is no I and no we beyond the body, beyond the flesh, no person separate from flesh, no self separate from what the body is and does. And before you biblical scholars jump on me, I am not using flesh in the Pauline sense. We can talk more about that in the Q&A. My talk today offers a sort of a kind of 3-part series of reflections. You might like one of them more than others. Feel free to veg out in the middle of one if you don't like it. In the first, I describe some of the basic principles of queer philosophical anthropology with some note of the difference those principles have made to my own work. For those of you who have read the queer theology book, some of this will be a little bit familiar language, but expanded. In the second part, I use this starting point to develop a case study for how to approach one of the most contested politically and philosophically arenas relating to gender and sexuality in the United States and Europe. And this will be a direct continuation, actually, of Mark's paper in the Q&A that followed that. And this goes beyond Adventism, of course, but is also very much within it, given that horrendous statement on transgenderism. The case study is intended to set up an epistemology of attentiveness to flesh's communicative powers, to do by describing rather than describing what it would mean to do, philosophical anthropology in a different key. And finally, in another kind of case study, I contextualize some of these questions for our Adventist heritage by considering the motility of flesh as a source for theological and philosophical anthropology, asking what happens to philosophical anthropology and to worship when the togetherness of flesh is neglected or elided. While there are some things that I talk about in the middle section of my paper in much more explicit terms than I'd imagine are common in this room or even generally at AAR, I want to be clear that I do so not in order to be transgressive in some silly and self-indulgent way, you know how irritating that is, but because a certain kind of truth-telling and risk-taking are necessary components of the substance of the endeavor of what has to be there for this case study to work. But I am assuming you knew that you invited a queer theologian today, and we'll give it a shot. So first, queer philosophical anthropology. As we know, the relation between queer and Christian remains heavily contested, perhaps because it is populated with so many conflicting desires and aversions. For many of us, possibly not all of this in this room, I'd imagine that desires predominate, a certain desire for something, a recognition that the true message of the gospel is the transformation of all forms of binary distinction and hierarchical normativity into a kingdom, or even as some used to say, kingdom of reciprocity and freedom. For some fighters on the queer side of the cause, this includes the desire to say that Christianity is fundamentally queer, that queerness is a gift of God that needs only to be celebrated. In practice, though of course not in rhetoric, this typically ends up meaning that we should talk very loudly about the radical nature of queerness, condemn homophobes in the strongest terms, and say that queerness, like Christianity, upends binary distinctions. Homo and trans folks need to be brought to understand that they should be condemned in no uncertain terms, and so our desires make clear what the target of our aversions ought to be. The desire to bring queerness and Christianity together in these ways, of course, reflects significant cultural transformations that took place over the last several centuries, especially what Foucault famously describes as the coinage of the homosexual as a personage or a certain kind of person. But they also take advantage of certain strands in Christian theological or philosophical anthropology, some of which came up this morning, in particular the malleability, transformability, and variability of human being, precisely in and as that being is made in the inexhaustible image of God. These motifs cohere well with two very popular aspects of queer philosophical anthropology, namely these famous anti-essentialism and denaturalization techniques. Anti-essentialism famously denies that many of the organizing principles of human social life, including especially sexuality and gender, express some kind of essence of womanhood or manhood or masculinity or femininity, and particularly reject the idea that different genders are by nature sexually oriented toward one another. This, as you can see, then connects well to denaturalization, which denies that the typicalities or regularities, which we do often see in human social behaviors, and which are essential to our cognitive processes, of course, are natural rather than culturally constructed through reiteration of norms that come to form our inmost selves, but which we also fail to fully or successfully inhabit. That was Judith Butler in half a sentence, my friends. Anti-essentialism and denaturalization deny, again, that there are these pre-given forms of being to which humans ought to conform. Women are like this, men are like that, everybody should be a woman or a man, and that's how it should be. And note that for the purposes of this conference, while many proponents of anti-essentialism and denaturalization would see themselves as denying that there can be something like human nature, that denial too is typically held in theory and contradicted in practice. I put that one in there as a little seed for a Q&A. As I discussed in queer theology, however, anti-essentialism and denaturalization are far too often taken to be endpoints rather than starting points for queer reflection and exploration. Look, it's not natural, it's constructed. Woo! Mind blown. Many sophisticated thinkers, ranging from Ian Hacking to Donna Haraway to Karen Barad to Bruno Latour to Zakiya Yaman-Jackson, have challenged both the simplicity of these distinctions and the effective risk they take of ignoring the materiality of the body, which of course is absolutely culturally informed, so to speak, but never only the natural substrate on which the cultural and supervenes, which of course came up again in Mark's talk. But such challenges have done little to dethrone the casual seductiveness of how definitively anti-essentialism and denaturalization seem to provide points of resistance to reigning ideologies. Look, power says that's just how things are, but they're not. Things aren't binaries, they're continuums. Woo. The assumption, sadly, very seldom backed up by events, is that these insights will then lead to positive effects and transformation towards the better in human social life. And as you can imagine, in recent years, I've given a fair number of lectures on queer theology and theory. And in some cases, I can tell people are always too polite to say it so straightforwardly. But I can tell that the audience was hoping for something else than what they got. They wanted the standard line, the line of radical love, inclusion, and acceptance, the excitement of a Christ who radically destabilizes every binary. And of course, there are versions of all of those claims that are obviously true. But as a scholar, I'm much more interested in the less positive and promising aspects of the relation between Christianity and queerness. Invited to say that God loves everyone, which of course is true, and is queer by nature, which is definitely not, I have found myself perhaps disappointing audiences a bit by being uninterested in the claim and the presumptive consequences. I don't mean that in a kind of self-dramatizing way. Look, all these normal people say this, and I give the radical queer alternative. These days, the word radical basically functions as a sign word indicating I didn't bother to do any thinking, but I thought it sounded cool. Or perhaps more simply and less harshly, I want to show that I'm on the side of the good, like you, without having to ask whether we really do want the same thing and have the same vision for social transformation. So instead of getting the hoped for radical line that'll make us all feel good, audiences typically get a very pessimistic Protestant anthropology that sees the most promising lines of intersection between historical Christian theology and queer theory in their mutual suspicion of human attempts to be good, and their recognition of the violences that ensue when the good in their goodness, as queer theorist Lee Edelman puts it, try to impose their vision on others by getting rid of those irritating obstacles to human unity without whom we could flourish. I believe Bonnie Dwyer has written a fair amount about situations where the good in their goodness are doing exactly that. Today, maybe for the first time, at least this explicitly, I'm going to try out this queer philosophical anthropology that incorporates one of these best insights of Adventism, a site where perhaps Adventism and queer might cohere or converge for one single suspended moment in a hotel room in Denver that tends positive rather than negative, towards possibility rather than failure and fracture. Or maybe better, because it's still what I'm gonna be interested in, better how flesh can learn to do antagonism better. That's me being optimistic. As I've said, or started with, one of the most unusual characteristics of Adventism was this refusal of the intrinsic immortality of the soul, or better, a refusal of the soul as such. Rather than positing a person individuating principle that is other than the body and can be maintained without it, Adventism, at least in theory, went for flesh all the way down. Or what my father, Sigmund Tonstad, likes to refer to as a monistic anthropology. Without getting into significant debates, although they're very interesting, about the relation between the mind and the brain, the term flesh, as I'm using it, includes the entirety of what a human being is, which is being, mind, selfhood, all at once. It is flesh that speaks, body that thinks. Flesh is what we are. But flesh is not ever other than body, which means flesh matters. And of course, that flesh matters means also that gender matters, even as people disagree about what gender even is. If it's something everyone has, if it allows for mobility and motility, transformative ways of being, if living out one's gender in the correct way is an ethical imperative, how one should understand the relation between gender and sexuality, and so on and so on. Which brings us to this case study, Matters of Gender. That gender matters seems both so obvious that it might not need to be said at all, and so important that many of our most pressing global and local concerns cannot be seriously engaged with unless we examine the multiple and often contradictory ways in which gender matters. The case study in thinking about gender that I'm about to present is intended in part as a methodological example, an example of what method I suggest we might want to use in these matters. And of course, it's also modeling possibilities for engagement in a world where gender is a matter of deep disagreement at the moment, generating political divisions in state curricula in the United States, as well as showing up in Patriarch Kirill's full-throated endorsement of Putin's war, to name just a couple of examples. And as I've said, I will not be sanitizing what I'm about to do in order to be faithful to queer critique's rejection of the distinction between the decent and the deserving, and the indecent and undeserving, where decency is about flesh behaving properly, and deservingness is about money, respect, and social recognition. This case study is grounded in lesbian, feminist, queer, and trans histories, and in the flesh of lesbian, feminist, queer, and trans people, and the contested distinctions and overlaps between them. And if you are not in those communities, you may not know just how painful those distinctions can be. Lesbian, feminist, queer, and trans people are among those from whom we might learn how to think philosophical anthropology better. And in a different talk, I would talk about doing it better as well. And this case study takes as its point of departure a site of pain, a site of struggle, sometimes returning to a place of pain. And gender divisions in lesbian, queer, and trans circles are decidedly a place of such pain, as might some of these discussions be in Adventism as well, might offer resources for working towards a better future. And just one brief note on terminology, I use a mix of designations for lesbian or queer or trans or lesbian, queer, trans people in this case study that do not always reflect the correct standards for current usage. We can talk more about that afterwards. Joan Nestley's edited volume, The Persistent Desire, a femme butch reader, came out in 1992. It became an instant classic, not only because of the distinguished lineup of contributors it had that offered up memory, poetry, erotics, and theory, but also because butch-femme relationships had become flashpoints for feminist disagreement. Historically, butch and femme are lesbian and maybe queer genders. And in the 1970s, as feminism's so-called second wave rolled over the United States, butch and femme became heavily contested terms, heavily contested gendered styles, or possibly genders. The conventional wisdom in middle-class, mostly white feminist circles was that butch and femme were outdated ways to organize lesbian relationships because they imitated heterosexuality. The rage that rises up in me, even in referring to that accusation, is really something. I have a deep investment in honoring the memories of those whose risk-taking, often with exposure to incredible degrees of violence, created the world in which my own queerness has met much less, though by no means no, violence. Wanting to free themselves and others from stereotypically gendered expectations, many feminists, especially maybe those from respectable middle-class backgrounds, rejected butch and femme as outdated and heteropatriarchal. Instead, you had this relatively low-key t-shirt, jeans, makeup-free styles that were thought to avoid exaggeratedly gendered forms of expression. But as is always the case, not all feminists agreed. Some Black, white, or Chicana, using the term in the book at the time, queer women from working class backgrounds, and some historians recognized the deep significance that class and racial differences had in the formation of lesbian social relationships. Already in the early 1900s, upper class and later middle class, mostly white women, were often able to create extensive lesbian social networks in their homes. They weren't all white. If you don't know about Alelia Walker, you should read about her, but which had plenty of room for entertaining, right? Because money means a door you can lock, and it means a space that you can, in a certain sense, control. And these homes were often in Paris, Bloomsbury, London, New York. And of course, working class white, brown, and Black women did not have access to that kind of space. They were much more often consigned to meeting other lesbians in bars. Note here that we already see here the imbrication of sexuality with property ownership, and with the distinction between public and private space. Because of the laws licensing alcohol following the repeal of prohibition in the United States in 1933, and these laws, by the way, included in the 1950s investigators who would go to gay bars to watch whether a man, when he ordered a beer, gestured in a way that could be considered bad, right? And would then write that down and take away the bar's liquor license, right? This is the history here. Because of laws licensing alcohol following the repeal of prohibition, and due to gender norms that frowned on women meeting in public places to drink, lesbian bars were often considered disreputable by those coming from respectable social backgrounds. Yet they were also among the only places where same-sex attracted women could find each other. And it is in these bars, these working class, sometimes racially segregated, sometimes multiracial bars, that butch and femme emerged as social styles, as lesbian genders, or see, these terms are not good, right? And there's a story I've found so many variations on different countries, different decades even, when a woman was looking for an entry into queer life. Coming out once meant not coming out of the closet, but coming into the life that is homosexuality. The key was to find a masculine looking woman, a butch, or maybe if she was Black, a stud on the street, and follow her until she went into a lesbian bar. In one of the most significant early works of lesbian history, Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, Elizabeth Kennedy and Madeline Davis showed that in Buffalo in upstate New York, from about the late 1930s to the 1960s, butch femme culture was an integral part of the growth of lesbian community, culture, and consciousness, they say, because it announced lesbianism to the public and organized lesbian desire. Now here already, note that phrase, announced lesbianism to the public. Already we see some of the communicative potential of flesh, what it might mean to think philosophical anthropology from the communicative potential of flesh. And for many who understood their own genders and sexualities through these categories, butch and femme were also ways to insist against maybe a slightly desexualized political lesbian of the 70s feminism, to insist on the sexuality of gay womanhood and on the inventiveness and significance of the many queer genders that exist beyond the notorious binary. A colleague of mine once listed more than 50 queer genders on the board in a class. This persistent desire anthology has contributions from many authors who aren't necessarily well known today, 30 years later, but it also includes texts from people like Leslie Feinberg, author of the influential Stone Butch Blues, poet Audre Lorde, activist Amber Hollybaugh, the pioneering Chicana feminist Cherry Moraga, Black lesbian feminist poet Cheryl Clark, and the activist Patrick Califia, who co-founded the first lesbian feminist BDSM group in the United States. Several of these figures, especially Feinberg, Moraga, and Califia, are significant participants in the conflicts over gender that this study considers. I heard of Patrick Califia around 1998. I had recently discovered feminism, this discourse that finally explained so many of the experiences I'd had that I thought were, as they say, personal rather than political. I was a student at La Sierra in the throes of a short, tumultuous relationship with my second girlfriend, not a La Sierra student, a soft butch who was surprised that I hadn't heard of the famous Leatherdyke author of Macho Sluts, a book title that in its transgressive perfection remains iconic. Even if you don't like the sexuality, hear the creativity and hear the challenge, Macho Sluts. Patrick was then still known as Pat, at least publicly, though his gender was never uncomplicated, as so many genders are not. Let me share with you a brief bit from one of his poems in The Persistent Desire. The poem is called I Love Butches. And while we shouldn't necessarily identify the I of a poem with the I of its author, I want to take a moment to notice the complexity of the contours of sexuality and gender as they appear here. And again, I know that there are different attitudes towards some of these things likely to be present in this room. Try to hear a version if you don't like the version that is actually on offer. I love butches, the muscles, the short hair. Butches need my hands, my mouth, my eyes, because I see, I handle, I bestow the hard-on, the female phallus. Understand me, my tricks are butches, not men, not boys, butches. Even if they seem like boys with female parts to you, I know they are women. I am, after all, a lesbian. I lust after beautiful women, and butches are the most beautiful women in the world. Butches, Patrick, at the time, Pat, writes, muscles, short hair, a phallus, a female phallus recognized by the lesbian whose desire is for butches, the most beautiful women in the world. And whatever you think about the gender mappings that are happening here, this does not map on easily onto any rigid accounts of gender identity, of bodily morphology or sexuality, even as it touches on all of them. As I've suggested, Califia's own gender and the boundaries of butch, boy spelled with a Y, boy spelled with an I, and woman shift over time. How does one learn to see sex, gender, sexuality? They're so different in this poem that even listing them or sort of naming them, here's the sex, here's the gender, here's the sexuality, completely misses the point. How does one learn to see, to experience, as Califia does, with so much specificity, with the entirety of what flesh is, which imagines, touches, desires, and sometimes thinks? It requires paying attention to the flesh in complicated relational social structures in which some of these relations are antagonistic. Let me try to say a little bit more about what that means by turning to another wonderfully titled text, first published 30 years ago, of Catamites and Kings, Reflections on Butch, Gender, and Boundaries, by the influential theorist of sexuality, Gail Rubin. Of Catamites and Kings takes up what are sometimes called the border wars, the debates in gay, queer, and trans circles over how to understand, name, classify, engage with, and of course live lives and genders that don't share the same map of the terrain of gender and sexuality. And I can tell you that in my own local social environment, the border wars are still going. In her examination of differently gendered lives, Rubin pays close attention to commonalities and differences, acknowledging exceptions and inadequacies, disagreements about what things mean and what they should mean. As Rubin points out, among lesbian and bisexual women, as in the general population, there are individuals who strongly identify as masculine or feminine, as well as individuals whose gender preferences are more flexible or fluid. Rubin traces, for example, a variety of different meanings of masculinity, noting that sometimes masculinity signals lesbianism. That's how you find the butch, right? But on other times, putting on masculinity might be a way for women to claim power. Or sometimes it's just women who find men's clothing better made. And at the same time, she continues, butch is also the indigenous lesbian category for women who are gender dysphoric. That's her language. And Rubin emphasizes that unlike current usage, she doesn't mean dysphoric as a clinical or diagnostic category, as a something has gone wrong category, but as a descriptive term for a whole range of non-standard relationships between one's gender feelings and identities and one's body. Dysphoria, Rubin says, comes in many variants, and she traces some of these differences. She says, many butches have partially male gender identities. Others border on being, and some are, female to male transsexuals, although many lesbians and FTMs find the areas of overlap between butchness and transsexualism disturbing. Saying that many butches identify as masculine to some degree does not mean at all that some or even most butches want to be men, although some definitely do. Most butches enjoy combining expressions of masculinity with a female body. The coexistence of masculine traits with a female anatomy is, Rubin continues, a highly charged, eroticized lesbian signal. Butches are different from each other, and Rubin refuses to adjudicate those differences, even as she recognizes the pain that is often written into these sites of conflict. Rubin goes on to describe stereotypical visions of butchness. Think a lesbian James Dean or Marlon Brando, as embodied by lesbian feminist performance artist Peggy Shaw, author of the book A Menopausal Gentleman. But Rubin points out that there are also many different ways to be masculine. Men get to express masculinity with numerous and diverse cultural codes. She says there are at least as many ways to be butch as there are ways for men to be masculine. And of course, the cool bit is actually there are more ways to be butch, she continues, because when women appropriate masculine styles, the element of travesty produces new significance and meaning. And like signals of masculinity, butch signaling varies according to race, culture, nation, class, and other factors. Part of the point here is that Rubin utterly rejects the idea that if we simply worked hard enough, we could come up with classifications and categories for all the ways humans relate to each other and differ from each other, solving the border wars so we could all agree on the rules. Instead, Rubin points out that butches and trans men are both similar to and different from each other. Sometimes butches transition later on. Sometimes people try out a butch identity and a trans identity in order to determine which is the right fit for them. Sometimes you can't tell a butch from a trans man by any outward sign. These differences are confused and overlapping, Rubin insists, not in bad or dangerous ways. They just can't be mapped on as fixed sort of terrain, as if they were a fixed sort of terrain. And even though, and here's where some of the tragedy enters, there is so much overlap at the border, part of Rubin's concern is the policing and controlling responses that many, including within these communities, have to those whose senses of gender differ from their own. Rubin recognizes that people's emotional responses to others can't and shouldn't be policed or controlled. It's okay to dislike what you yourself dislike and don't find attractive. You've got yours, I've got mine. But Rubin insists that, as she puts it, intense emotions make bad policy. Now, she doesn't have an emotion-free arrangement of sex and gender relations in mind, but she worries for rather excellent reasons that we struggle to react well when we experience distaste, alienation, confusion, or threat in relation to sex and gender practices that differ from our own. Rubin is very insistent that instead of sorting people out through some kind of classification, what she calls border patrols, surveillance, and expulsion, and boy, could we tell some ethnicist histories under those terms, she advocates letting people figure out for themselves where their most significant attachments will be. A lesbian doesn't necessarily become not a lesbian because her partner transitions, although some do. People transition in different ways, using different technologies, as well as differently gendered symbols, identities, and bodily morphologies. Some of us will find these combinations attractive. Some of us will want to or have tried them out for ourselves. Some of us don't and won't. Again, Rubin, if community membership were based on universal desirability, no one would qualify. Our desires can be as selective, exclusive, and imperious as we like. Our society should be as inclusive, humane, and tolerant as we can make it. Note here, the tolerance does not overwrite the antagonism and the dislike. That's one of the crucial parts here, because there is no version of human sociality where we overcome that kind of antagonism. The question is, how do we learn to live with it and make it a little less violent? In other words, people are different. We won't always like it. People change in their own lifetimes and over time. No identity or strategy will work for everyone or always. Categories and identities are important and incomplete. Okay, with a bunch of lesbian feminist history that you may or may not have known, let me trace something of this case study's implications for how we might do philosophical anthropology better in the flesh. Now, of course, my quick summary here isn't doing justice to the sophistication and subtlety of how Rubin thinks about differences in sex, gender, sexuality, what people now call identity, though many of us wish they would not. But what we can see is that her deep enmeshment in lesbian, trans, queer, dyke, etc. circles, including her exposure to many lesbians who saw her own investment in S&M cultures as violent and wrong, taught her a very great deal about how gender is lived, how sexuality is negotiated, and offered a kind of template for recognizing real conflicts without treating them either as final or as soluble in principle. That is, the case study reflects the careful attention Rubin pays to the people among and with whom she lives. The case study thus might have significance for any matter of flesh, not only gender, where conflictual divergences along these lines, classification, identity, are present. What Rubin does is to pay attention to flesh, to how it communicates, to how it signals, to how flesh creates new possibilities through what are taken to be contradictions or inventiveness. She notes gendered markers, but she thinks about symbolism as it's actually deployed in her communities, rather than according to abstract ideas of what signifies what in terms of gender. And she knows that across a single life, people sometimes live many different lives, as I and perhaps some of you have done. The philosophical anthropology of the flesh requires paying attention, engagement with the other, and a wisdom attuned to bodily communication, how the interpretive and motile aspects of flesh inform each other. Which brings us to, in our final part, a move that if you've read a couple of my shorter recent pieces, you may have anticipated, but that's okay. Dancing anthropology. So let me add one more piece to Rubin's epistemology of the flesh, if we might call it such. It's the place that for me has been the most instructive in recent years, particularly when it comes to engaging with what Adventism promised but failed to deliver: the love of God-loved flesh, the illimitable ultimacy of God-loved flesh. You see, as I've written about in a few different places recently, 4 years ago, I learned to dance. That is, I became a raver. More on that in a moment. In an eccentric book published in 1995, Keeping Together in Time, Dance and Drill in Human History, William McNeill argues across a rather vast swath of time that moving our muscles rhythmically and giving voice consolidate group solidarity by altering human feelings. He says moving our muscles and giving voice consolidate group solidarity by altering human feelings. As social fleshy beings, collective capacities that exceed what we could do by simply adding up individual capacities, and that maybe for a short time overcome or transform certain antagonisms, maybe rendering them a little bit irrelevant for a while, stem directly from collective rhythmic motion to the beat of a drum. The evolution of cooperation in human communities, which includes a larger number of participants than we typically see in the cases of most other complex mammals, seem to have evolved in tandem with rhythmic collective movement. And just parenthetically, McNeill believes, this is maybe one of the more eccentric parts, that exposure to the trance from which dancers awake when they stop moving, and you have to imagine many hours here, right, over and over and over, may have been the origin of the idea of the soul. Because it returns specificity and responsiveness to a body that has temporarily become only sort of meditative movement without that kind of, a certain kind of presence. We have reason to believe, evolutionarily speaking, that the capacity for music and for rhythm precedes and grounds the capacity for language, a deepening and expansion of sociality. And that among the most basic and long-standing solidarity-creating practices in which flesh engages is keeping together in time, moving in sometimes complexly synchronized ways to a steady beat. Or as I like to put it, we became human by dancing to repetitive beats under the stars. And Adventism forbids dancing. It's such a trivial thing, right? Such a small entry on the list of prohibitions: coffee, alcohol, shrimp, homosexuality, blah, blah, blah. All of which are supposed to be about the purification and intensification of flesh for the purpose of worship, or an exploration of the orientation of flesh to what is greater, though not in a measurable way. No, God is not a being among other things, or a thing among other things. An exposure of a deepening of the orientation of flesh to what is greater than any flesh can be on its own, that mysterious generosity that lies at the heart of the universe. Almost any human flesh, no matter its degree of debility, can and does respond to rhythmic music in some ways. Toddlers dance. Elderly people whose memories are going sing the songs of their youth and live longer, happier, and healthier lives when their access to dancing is facilitated. Now, of course, as anyone who's ever been to Loma Linda knows, movement alone is a significant factor in that. Hiking, marathoning, just going for walks, or any number of other things. But whatever movement any flesh is capable of doing benefits that flesh. But dancing adds something more than that, especially when it's group rather than paired dancing. It adds an element of nonverbal sociality in groups that mix strangers and friends, similar and different people whose views on matters of conflict, including religion, spirituality, race, gender, sexuality, and politics, are different, yet whose flesh can momentarily, evanescently, but nonetheless move in sync, creating an experience of togetherness that sidelines, at least for a moment, many of the most soul-like aspects of human beings, verbality, etc., in favor of a more obvious humanimality, as scholars like Eric Darrell Mayer have taken to calling it. Becoming a raver for me, learning to see as dancers do, taught me more about human sociality than I had imagined was possible. Taught me how to read body language, and that we're often better readers of body language than we know. And also we often get it wrong when we think we're getting it right. It taught me an anthropology of space making, going in, not standing on the sidelines, wishing for recognition. Do you see me? Can you invite me? Do I get to play? But rather that going in, taking risks creates possibilities for others, especially when the self and self-consciousness are set aside. Dancing is often considered suspicious, dangerous, or trivial. It's associated with disorderly crowds, with excessive frenzy, with flesh's temptations, and of course, with communion with the divine. The history of dance shows how often dance appears as an object of regulation. Dance threatens the production of responsible subjects who can become reliable payers of debt, with all the other forms of proper bourgeois behavior that requires. We know this in the history of Adventism too. There was a moment early on when dance, convulsion, or unregulated movement were more threatening to civic religious powers than any preaching of the seventh-day Sabbath and the soon return of Christ have yet shown themselves to be. You know the court cases better than I do, I'm sure. In her book, Choreomania, Dance and Disorder, Kalina Gottman examines how the other of European modernity was made via representations of the disorderly collectivity found in purposeless, unsmoothed, unregulated dance, the way this was constituted as a threat So you have the threat of the dancing body as a co-constituer of the other of European modernity. Doctors, scholars, and officials wrote histories containing invented or described the dance manias. They wrote fantasies of unwieldy and disruptive motion, Gottman says, that made dancing crowds into objects of medical knowledge and classification and objects of political and civic control. And think only of the English woman doing her sort of famous grand tour to all the non-white areas, writing details about, frenzy and clothing and all the things that sort of were part of how racialization was produced in this context. For Gottman, this choreomania, which is a history of ideas about an epidemic disorder, a dancing plague, is saturated with Orientalist prejudices against obscurity, unintelligibility, primitiveness, and Eastern-inflected Dionysianism. The discursive history of choreomania, she says, describes ways of reading bodily motion and ways this reading itself can be construed as a conceptual act, an act of philosophy, determined by the material realities of its author's routes. An act of philosophy, a philosophical anthropology of the flesh, or at least one small contribution to it. And I think the study on Nigerian Adventism in the most recent spectrum is another contribution. For Gottman, choreomania is both feminized and queered. It stands against individualism. Choreomania presents a potent fantasy of collective disintegration, she says, far more politically grievous than the figure of the individual hysteric, linking jerks and twitches, political movement, and ecological upheaval. And again, think of this history of choreomania as the dancing plague, which links ideas of epidemic and infectiousness through the imitative communion of purposeless movement from body to body. I have a lot of other stuff that's going on about thinking about plagues and communication after the last several years, but that's another writing. And you can see, of course, then how religion and religious frenzy are related to choreomania. Queer theorist and scholar of 19th century America, Elizabeth Freeman, shows that shaker motion, shaker dance, was taken as indicative not only of a suspect Christianity, but of a suspect racial identity. There was something Indian-like in early shaker motions, it was said. In order to counter such charges, shakers moved from their early disorderly and jerky motions to the rhythmic regularity for which they are now best known, Freeman points out. And of course, as you might have imagined then, others critiqued shaker movement for being too regulated, too synchronized. Now that's the scary version, right? In the end, Freeman argues that shaker rhythms were both queer and sacred, for they lifted the shakers out of various earthly tempos and united them with one another in a spiritual form of belonging that Freeman reads as both queer and Christian. That description of being lifted out of earthly tempos might, for this audience, remind us of something else, language we often use for Sabbath keeping. Yet too often Sabbath keeping, at least in the context with which I was once familiar, involved for the flesh at best synchronized swaying to an admittedly very effective praise music program. While congregants are side by side, they're still mostly placed in orderly rows, with perhaps occasional reverent movement to the front of the room for a particularly intensified prayer session. And this is the one that moves, right? We all know. Try growing up in Norway with that, right? Absolutely. There are other people here, we do not move. And this is not the combination of individual particularity and collective encounter, this rhythmic praise swaying, right? The celebration center outside Loma Linda, that was once my exposure to that characterizes the best dance floors, where the complex and asymmetrical socialities that flesh invents, when left to do one of the things it does best, suggests a human appetite for asymmetrical harmonies and counterpoints, the movement between individual effacement in side-by-side non-interactive dancing, and collective recognition in the meeting of eyes or the reciprocity of a particular movement, sometimes even from across the room. Am I suggesting that Adventists need to learn to dance on Sabbath in order to stay faithful to their message? Possibly. But I'm at a minimum arguing that there's a fleshy anthropology of dance that both resonates with and transforms, maybe in some ways threatens, Adventist and dominant Christian and cultural ways of thinking about human being. That dance is one way to learn to be human animals together and to learn what it is to be flesh. Such learning is urgently necessary, for our only hope for social transformation lies in some kind of collective action with strangers, maybe even our enemies. And philosophical anthropology always lies at the intersection of what we are and what might yet become. Thank you.